Elara Voss, Marcus Duvall, and Isabelle Reinhart, three names that would become entwined in a story of glamour, deception, and murder. Elara thought she had been chosen for a life of luxury by a Swiss prince, Marcus Duvall, only to discover that the world she stepped into was a carefully constructed trap. Isabelle Reinhart, the seemingly loyal assistant, held secrets that would shatter everything Elara believed. What began as a dream ended in a chilling reality, one life stolen, one illusion exposed, and a mystery that still haunts the United States today. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. Elara Voss had always lived a life that could be described as ordinary. She grew up in a quiet suburban town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's birthdays and secrets rarely left the neighborhood. Her parents were hardworking and loving, but their lives revolved around routine, work, school, weekend chores, and family dinners. Elara was bright, ambitious, and quietly adventurous, but she had never imagined her life could stretch beyond the borders of her small world. Modeling had always been a hobby, something she enjoyed but never thought could become a career. She often shared her photos online, mostly for friends to see, never expecting anyone significant to notice them. It began with a single message that appeared in her inbox, from someone claiming to represent a prestigious international modeling agency. The words were flattering and polished, promising opportunities that seemed almost too good to be true. At first, she hesitated. She had been warned about online scams, but the message seemed legitimate, complete with a fish-looking logos, a professional tone, and even a verified email address. Within days, her inbox filled with more correspondence. The messages were persistent but polite, emphasizing how rare it was for someone like her to be noticed and how carefully she had been chosen. Then came the first mention of the man who would change her life. He was described as a Swiss prince, an heir to centuries of wealth and influence, known for discretion and refinement. He had seen her photos and was impressed by her elegance, intelligence, and poise. The messages were convincing, speaking in a way that suggested careful attention to detail and knowledge of her personal life, which made the offer feel even more real. They promised that he wanted to meet her in person, that her selection was not random, but a rare honor. The world she had only dreamed of, luxury, travel, freedom from financial worries, was suddenly within reach. Elara felt a thrill she could barely explain. For the first time, she believed that she had been chosen for something extraordinary. It was flattering, intoxicating, and overwhelming. Every detail of the arrangement seemed designed to build trust and admiration. Flights on private jets, invitations to exclusive events, and messages emphasizing safety and discretion. She began to imagine herself walking through grand European halls, wearing dresses she had only seen in magazines, meeting influential people who could open doors she never knew existed. The fantasy consumed her. Her parents were hesitant when she told them about the opportunity, warning her to be careful, but she reassured them. After all, nothing about the messages suggested danger. Everything was polished, formal, and convincing. The more she corresponded with the representatives and the man himself, the more certain she became that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. By the time her plane tickets arrived, with every detail meticulously arranged, she had convinced herself that she was stepping into a life she had always been meant for. The excitement eclipsed any lingering doubts. Elara believed she had been chosen, not by chance, but by destiny itself, and she could not have imagined the darkness that lay hidden behind the promises of luxury and love. Elara's arrival in Europe, or so she thought, felt like stepping into a dream. Everything around her screamed wealth and sophistication. The first hotel she stayed in was palatial, with marble floors, towering ceilings, and staff who seemed to anticipate her every need. Luxury became the standard, not an exception. Private cars waited to take her anywhere she wanted to go, and invitations to galas, parties, and art exhibitions arrived almost daily. At first, she was thrilled. She had imagined a life of glamour, and now it seemed to be unfolding exactly as promised. Every day, she was reminded of the prince's attention. Handwritten notes, carefully chosen gifts, and messages filled with admiration convinced her that she was valued in a way she had never been before. But the perfection came with rules she barely noticed at first. The prince insisted on privacy, explaining that as a public figure, her life needed protection. Her phone was monitored for security reasons, and her social media accounts were deleted to maintain discretion. She was told that leaving the hotel without supervision was risky, that certain neighborhoods were unsafe, and that strangers could easily exploit her fame. The instructions seemed reasonable at the time. After all, she had been chosen for greatness, and greatness demanded caution. Slowly, however, the rules began to feel more like restrictions. Her interactions with the prince were carefully orchestrated. He appeared only at certain times, in carefully staged settings, leaving the rest of her time in the hands of assistants and handlers whose names changed frequently. Each new face promised safety, guidance, and access to the prince's world. Yet they never explained the full picture, and the frequent changes made it impossible for Elara to form trust. She started noticing small inconsistencies, details that didn't add up, schedules that were unnecessarily complicated, and explanations that felt rehearsed. Still, the allure of luxury kept her from questioning too deeply. Isolation crept in quietly. Friends from home could no longer reach her, as the communications she did have were monitored or delayed. The calls that did get through were brief and carefully controlled. Even her family was reassured that everything was fine, that she was in the hands of people who cared. Elara began to feel the weight of the golden cage she had stepped into. The lavish rooms, the exquisite food, the endless gifts, they all came with an invisible barrier, separating her from the life she had known and the people who truly cared about her. By the time the reality of her situation began to sink in, Elara had already invested herself completely. The prince's attention, however rare it became, was intoxicating. Every appearance felt like confirmation that she was special, chosen, and destined for an extraordinary life. The contrast between these moments of adoration and the periods of confinement was jarring. But she told herself it was part of the privilege she had been granted. Behind the elegance, the glamour, and the carefully maintained image of protection, a more sinister truth was quietly forming, one that she could not yet see. The life she had dreamed of was not a life at all. It was a carefully constructed illusion, designed to keep her under control, while the world watched a fantasy that existed only for the prince. Elara expected to continue her life of luxury in Europe, traveling from city to city, attending grand events, and meeting people who could open doors to fame and influence. Instead, she was told she needed to go to the United States temporarily for business matters connected to the prince's investments. At first, it seemed like a brief stop, a natural part of her new life of privilege. She packed her belongings carefully, trusting the instructions she was given, imagining a short stay before returning to the grandeur of European society. The jet ride was smooth, the private cabin quiet, yet the air was heavy with a strange sense of tension that she could not yet place. Upon arrival, she was taken to a sprawling estate in a quiet American state. From the outside, it looked like the kind of mansion that belonged in magazines, a vast lawn, high gates, and security cameras discreetly positioned. Inside, the home was meticulously maintained, filled with luxury furniture, art pieces, and technology that could monitor almost every room. For a moment, Elara told herself it was perfect. She had the comfort of wealth, the feeling of being cared for, and the presence of the prince, even if he appeared only briefly. But the first night brought a strange unease. Security personnel were always present, sometimes in rooms nearby, sometimes hidden, watching quietly. She was not allowed to wander freely, and even stepping outside alone was forbidden. At first, Elara tried to convince herself it was precaution, that being chosen by someone so powerful meant protection, not control. Yet small things began to stand out. Visitors arrived and left at odd hours, each claiming authority but giving conflicting instructions. The prince himself became more distant, appearing rarely, often in the middle of the night, always leaving quickly with little explanation. Her days started to follow a rigid schedule designed by others: meals at specific times, exercise in monitored spaces, and carefully curated activities. Every attempt to deviate, to make a simple phone call or go for a walk outside, was met with resistance, framed as concern for her safety. Isolation settled over her slowly. The estate was remote, surrounded by thick trees and long driveways, cutting her off from neighbors and townspeople. Her friends and family back home received only controlled updates, never the truth of her situation. At first, she told herself it was temporary, part of the prince's plan to protect her. But as weeks passed, the reality of her confinement became harder to ignore. The mansion, once thrilling in its grandeur, began to feel like a gilded cage. Her identity was being absorbed into the illusion of the prince's world, and every day, the possibility of leaving diminished. Despite the increasing restrictions, Elara still held on to the hope that the prince's promises were real. Each brief encounter with him reinforced the fantasy, smiles, compliments, gestures that seemed intimate but were carefully controlled. She began to realize that the luxury she had imagined came with a price she had not anticipated. The more she experienced it, the less freedom she had. She was living a life that looked perfect to outsiders, but behind the gates of the estate, the reality was suffocating, and the illusion of choice was fading with every passing day. Elara had begun to feel the weight of her surroundings, though she still clung to the hope that this was all part of a carefully planned, temporary arrangement. But the cracks in the fantasy were becoming harder to ignore. Small inconsistencies emerged in ways that unsettled her. The prince, whom she had believed to be a man of verified royalty, had no records confirming his title or wealth. Every attempt she made to verify details, names, properties, connections, was met with vague answers or deflected with charm. She realized she had never seen official documents, passports, or even photos of his supposed family. Each carefully constructed encounter that had once seemed so magical now began to feel rehearsed, like pieces of a stage set designed to convince her she was part of something grand. Gifts and luxury items, which had once seemed tokens of affection, began to appear suspicious. They arrived without receipts, explanations, or origin stories. Packages were sometimes addressed to different names, and the people around her brushed off questions as unimportant. Money moved through accounts she had no access to, and every financial interaction was carefully monitored. Even her attempts to manage small tasks were controlled by the handlers who constantly rotated in and out of her life. Each person promised care and oversight, but the constant turnover made it impossible to build trust, and it made her increasingly aware of her dependence on them. The isolation, which had once felt like protection, now felt like imprisonment. She was moved between properties at odd hours of the night, never allowed to go anywhere alone. When she asked questions, the answers were always reassuring but vague. The prince's appearances became less frequent, and when he did appear, they were fleeting moments designed to maintain the illusion of intimacy. She began to notice patterns: cameras in every room, staff watching from hidden locations, and constant surveillance under the guise of security. She was learning, slowly and painfully, that her life had been stripped of normal freedoms under the guise of privilege. Despite the mounting unease, Elara clung to small glimpses of the dream she had been promised. Every carefully staged smile, every compliment from the prince, every moment of luxury became a reminder of what she had been told she deserved. The contrast between the attention and the restrictions created a confusion that made it difficult to separate reality from fantasy. She began to feel trapped not just physically, but mentally, as her perception of normal life started to blur with the illusions she was forced to live in. At the same time, a new fear began to take root. The inconsistencies, the secrecy, and the isolation all hinted that the situation was not just unusual but dangerous. The life she had imagined as glamorous and exciting was revealing itself as tightly controlled and opaque. She realized that the promises of love, attention, and status were no longer reliable indicators of safety or happiness. Somewhere behind the charm, the luxury, and the sophistication, there was a darker truth she could not yet see. The cracks in the fantasy were widening, and with each passing day, Elara understood that the world she had been pulled into was not a kingdom of elegance, but a carefully constructed prison. The signs had been there for months, small and unsettling, but it wasn't until Elara started paying closer attention that the reality became undeniable. She was not a guest in a palace, not a beloved partner of a wealthy prince. She was a tool, an asset carefully placed and meticulously controlled. The luxurious lifestyle, the exclusive events, the attention from the prince himself, They were all part of a system designed to exploit her presence. She realized that her image was being used to project power and influence, to impress investors, and to build trust in business ventures she knew nothing about. Every compliment she had received, every flattering message, every fleeting appearance of affection had been calculated to maintain her compliance and her visibility. Elara began to notice the financial patterns around her. Money flowed through a network of companies with obscure names, moving across borders without clear purpose. Shell companies and untraceable accounts were connected to her presence, and she realized that she herself had become a currency in this network. She had been groomed to appear desirable, charming, and untouchable, so that her mere existence could create an image of credibility for the prince's business dealings. The truth struck her with a cold clarity. Once her value declined, once she no longer served the purpose they had chosen her for, she could become disposable. The restrictions tightened almost overnight. Her movements were tracked more closely, her interactions monitored, and her personal belongings controlled with precision. Phones, letters, and even small personal items were checked or removed entirely. The prince's presence became increasingly rare, leaving her with only handlers whose loyalty was to him, not to her. Every day felt like walking a narrow path, where one wrong step could have consequences she could not predict. She was isolated not as a mark of care, but as a method of control, cut off from anyone who might notice the warning signs and intervene. Fear became a constant companion. Elara began to understand that the freedom she once thought she had was an illusion. Every opportunity for connection or escape had been anticipated and blocked. Even attempts to reach her family or old friends were monitored or manipulated, leaving her with no clear path back to the life she had known. The realization that she was trapped began to take root in her mind, and with it came a quiet terror. The world outside the estate seemed distant and unreachable, and the lavish surroundings that had once felt like a dream now felt like a carefully constructed cage. At night, alone in her opulent room, she pieced together the truth. She was chosen not for love or status, but for her ability to embody an image that others would believe in, a glamorous, powerful, untouchable figure who could be manipulated for financial gain. Every interaction, every moment of luxury had been orchestrated to reinforce her usefulness. The very life she had dreamed of, the life she had imagined as the reward for being special, had been a trap from the start. She was not the princess of a fairy tale. She was a pawn in a dangerous game, and the players around her were already planning the moves that would determine her fate. Winter arrived with a cold, grey heaviness that seemed to seep into every corner of the estate. Elara had grown accustomed to the isolation, the surveillance, and the constant presence of unseen eyes, but the tension in the house was now unmistakable. The prince's appearances had dwindled to almost nothing, and the handlers were more severe and watchful than ever. Every day felt like a test, where her movements, her words, and even her expressions were carefully monitored. She had begun to understand that she was no longer part of a glamorous fantasy, but a liability, someone who could be discarded if she ceased to be useful. The final day began like any other. Meals were delivered at precise intervals, rooms were checked and secured, and her schedule was dictated entirely by others. She had learned to comply without resistance, understanding that any deviation could provoke scrutiny or punishment. There was no chaos, no confrontation, nothing to suggest that the day would end differently from the countless others before it. Yet something in the atmosphere felt heavier, more urgent. Even the staff seemed tense, moving quickly and quietly, communicating in subtle gestures rather than words. By evening, Elara was alone in her room, reflecting on the months that had passed. The mansion, which had once seemed like a palace, now felt like a prison. Her thoughts drifted to the life she had left behind, to the ordinary world of friends, family, and freedom. She realized that each luxurious moment had been carefully designed to make her compliant, to make her trust a man whose intentions were not what they appeared. She wondered how many others had been lured into similar situations, promised safety and status, only to vanish quietly into the shadows. Later that night, something shifted. She noticed subtle changes, doors slightly ajar, cameras redirected, and staff behaving with unusual precision. When she attempted to leave her room for water, she was gently but firmly stopped. The excuse given was always about security, but the tone carried an unspoken finality. She understood then that she was no longer merely controlled, her fate had been decided. There would be no more promises, no more staged moments, no more illusions of affection. Every measure of her confinement suggested that the people around her were no longer interested in keeping her alive as a participant in the charade. The disappearance was quiet, almost unnoticeable. In the dead of night, Elara was taken from the estate. There were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, no explanation left behind. Surveillance footage was conveniently missing or corrupted, and the prince himself departed the country within hours, leaving a carefully crafted alibi in his wake. The house returned to its cold, empty routine as if nothing had changed. Those who might have noticed her absence were told she had returned to Europe for personal reasons. Weeks passed without a missing person report, without inquiries, and without acknowledgement of the vanishing. The world outside remained unaware of what had just occurred, and inside the estate, silence filled the spaces where a young woman's life had existed. By the time the first questions were raised, it was too late. The luxury, the attention, the promise of a fairy tale life, all of it had disappeared along with Elara. The reality was stark. She had been removed deliberately, methodically. And the illusion of choice had been replaced with the finality of absence. Those who orchestrated her disappearance had achieved their goal without a trace, leaving behind only suspicion, questions, and the chilling certainty that a life built on fantasy had ended in an unfathomable tragedy. Months passed in uneasy quiet before the truth began to emerge, though the world still had no idea what had happened to Elara. The estate remained silent, abandoned in many ways, with staff either reassigned or quietly removed from the property. Those who had once moved under the guise of care and protection were now scattered, leaving only fragments of information that hinted at something sinister. It was not until hikers discovered human remains deep in a remote forest, miles from the estate, that the illusion of her life of luxury was shattered forever. The location was isolated, far from roads and neighborhoods, a place where a body could remain hidden for months without detection. Identification took time. Authorities worked methodically, piecing together evidence from personal effects, dental records, and fragments of clothing. When the remains were finally confirmed as Elara Voss, shock rippled through the small town she had come from and through the online communities that had followed her story. For months, she had been considered missing, a puzzle wrapped in silence and secrecy. The discovery was grim but undeniable. The girl who had been promised a life of elegance, freedom, and love had been murdered. The contrast between her imagined destiny and her tragic end was stark, almost surreal. Investigation quickly revealed the meticulous planning behind her disappearance and death. Evidence suggested she had not been a victim of chance or accident. The location of her remains, the way her body had been hidden, and the careful control over the estate all pointed to a premeditated act. Authorities traced financial transactions linked to the prince and his network. Shell companies in Switzerland, the United States, and offshore accounts all connected to her disappearance. The luxurious life that had once dazzled her and the world was now exposed as a facade, a tool used to manipulate and exploit her until she was no longer useful. As investigators dug deeper, the prince's identity began to crumble. Publicly, he had claimed royal heritage, centuries-old wealth, and global influence, but records told a different story. There were no royal titles, no verifiable lineage, and no legal claims to the fortunes he had flaunted. What remained were falsified documents, fabricated credentials, and a network of accomplices who ensured the illusion persisted long enough to exploit her. Each revelation painted him not as a prince, but as a calculating criminal whose charm and sophistication had masked a ruthless willingness to eliminate anyone who became inconvenient. The layers of deception shocked those who had once admired her story. Every photograph, every lavish trip, every promise of marriage had been carefully orchestrated to create a narrative that concealed manipulation and control. The investigation exposed how Elara's presence had been used to manipulate investors, launder money, and maintain the prince's image of power. Her life, once bright and full of potential, had been consumed by a system that measured her worth only in how effectively she could serve his schemes. Even as the details became public, questions remained. The prince had disappeared, leaving a trail of financial webs and falsified documents, and law enforcement could only chase fragments. Yet one undeniable truth emerged. The fantasy of wealth, romance, and status had been a trap, and the reality was murder. Elara's story, once filled with glamour and promise, became a chilling example of how appearances can mask danger, and how those who seem chosen for fortune can be ensnared in a deadly game they never imagined. The world slowly began to understand the full horror of what had happened to Elara Voss, though the truth was far more complicated and chilling than anyone could have imagined. The man who had promised her a life of luxury and romance was no prince at all. Investigations revealed him to be a master manipulator and con artist, a man who had built an empire of deception using charm, falsified documents, and a network of accomplices. His entire persona was a fabrication, carefully constructed to exploit people like Elara. The wealth, the elegance, and the private events had all been part of a facade, a glittering trap designed to ensnare those who appeared desirable or influential. Elara's story became a cautionary tale, shared across the media, social platforms, and true crime communities worldwide. Experts dissected the layers of manipulation that had led to her death. She had been groomed from the very beginning, chosen not for love, beauty, or status, but for the power her image could project. Every compliment, every staged encounter, every luxurious gift was part of a calculated plan to maintain her compliance and ensure she remained visible, useful, and unquestioning. Once her role in the scheme was no longer necessary, she became a risk, someone who could expose the truth or disrupt the operations, and the decision was made to eliminate her. Authorities pieced together the financial and logistical webs surrounding her life and death. Offshore accounts, shell companies, and a trail of falsified records revealed how carefully the prince had insulated himself from accountability. He had exploited the illusion of status and credibility to gain influence and manipulate others. Even as investigators connected these dots, the trail led to dead ends, disappearing funds, and intermediaries who claimed ignorance or disappeared themselves. The legal pursuit of justice became a complex battle against a man whose life had been constructed entirely as a series of lies. For those who knew Elara, the revelations were devastating. Her family and friends mourned not only her death, but the betrayal she had endured. The life she had imagined, the dream of adventure, wealth, and companionship, had been stolen from her from the very beginning. Yet in the tragedy, her story also served as a warning. It revealed how carefully curated appearances can hide danger, how trust can be weaponized, and how predators can exploit the dreams and vulnerabilities of those seeking opportunity or love. Even years after her death, the case continues to haunt investigators, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts. The man who had called himself a prince remains at large, his true identity still partially obscured by the layers of deception he left behind. Elara's legacy, however, is clear. She is remembered as more than a victim. Her story exposes the dark reality behind the glittering illusion of wealth and privilege, and serves as a chilling reminder that the lives we aspire to are not always what they seem. What appeared to be a fairy tale ended in murder, but the world now knows the truth. Elara Voss was never chosen for luxury or love. She was chosen to be exploited, and her story remains a stark warning of how appearances can be deadly.